Right, our enemy ship is behaving as we want it to. So the next thing to do is to concentrate on the game controller. But first of all, we'll need to make this enemy into a prefab so that we can instantiate more enemies with time. So I'm just going to drag a copy of that into the prefabs folder. And there it is. So the next thing to do is to create the standard game controller. So I've just created an empty and rename it game controller. And the main purpose of this is simply to hold a script, but I'll reset it anyway. So I'll add a new script to that, and I'm going to call this game control. Oh, this should be quite familiar to you by now. So we'll add that in. And now we can edit it. Right, so this is our new game controller. One of the first things we need to do, because we're going to spawn new enemies, is to put in a public reference to the enemies. So I'm going to call this enemy ship. Okay. Now, going back to the idea of this game takes place in a sort of drum, a notional drum, what we need to do is to bring in some areas of the drum. So I'm going to put in some more float variables. I'm going to call one the drum radius. Now this is essentially how far away the enemies are spawned. And I'm also going to put in the drum height. Okay. Now I'm going to put in some default values for those, so I'm going to put in 100 there. Whoops, drum height, should be drum height. And I'll make that 20, which is what I did with the ship control as well. Right. So the main purpose of this is to create new enemies. I'm going to put in a standard private boolean called game over, because of course the other main point of the game control code is to control when the game is over. So here in the start we'll put game over equals false. Now the next thing I'll want to do is to create a coroutine to spawn enemies. So this is going to be an IEnumerator. I'm going to call it spawn enemy. Right. So the first thing I'll do is to wait. So I'm going to start off with a yield return new, wait for seconds, and I'm going to give it a random time. And I'll say between 4 seconds and 10 seconds. And the reason for this is that we don't want to start fighting enemies straight away. So it gives you 4 to 10 seconds to just relax into the game for a bit. So after that, we're going to start making life difficult. So we're going to set up a loop now. So while, and the key thing is while it's not the end of the game, So while not game over, this is what we're going to do. I'm going to call this new enemy. Right, so instantiate an enemy ship. Okay, now the next thing I need to do is to be able to place it on the scene. I'm just going to show you what I'm looking for in this. So I've got a little PowerPoint presentation that I'd like to show you. Okay, what we're doing is looking down at our defender ship from above. So this is the forward axis, Z, and over here we've got the X, right axis. So I want to imagine this is the drum around the ship. Okay, and the ship is always in the middle of it, and we want to spawn enemies all the way around this ring. So just put a bit of detail in there. So the quadrants, so what they demarcate is that here X is 0 and here Z is 0, because the ship is in the middle at the 0, 0 point. So we can also imply from that here X is greater than 0 and Z is also greater than 0. Here X is greater than 0 but Z is less than 0, and so on around. Now say we wanted to, I'll put it 70 here, I've decided it's 100, but never mind. So we wanted to spawn an enemy up here at the end of this arrow. So we can automatically decide what we want our X value to be. So it can be any value between X equals 0 and X equals the radius. Okay. And which means that by using Pythagoras, it's amazing, the ancient Greeks are still there while we're doing game design. We can work out the Z component just using Pythagoras, which is, as you probably know, it's going to be 70 squared minus 20 squared and the square root of that. So our Z value is going to be the square root of 70 squared, or whatever the radius is, minus our X value squared. Okay. Now, if we wanted to bring it outside this quadrant, then all we'd have to do to go in this quadrant is to say, well, we're going to flip Z to a negative number. And then we've got this point, and we can flip the X to be negative over there. And if we want to flip them both, we can flip the X and the Z to negative here. So that's basically what I'm going to try and do now. So let's go back to the code. Right, we're back in the code. So I can put in my X position. So I'm going to create a new variable. I'm going to call this xpos. And I'm going to say that's going to be a random number random range from 0 up to the drum radius. Now I want to be able to flip this around, so if I want to go into the left quadrant, I might want to change it so that it's negative. Okay, so I'm going to build another function here which is going to switch the sign, possibly. So I'm going to just come out here for a minute, and I'm going to create a function which returns an int, not void. I'm going to call this switch sign, and we don't have to feed anything into it. And I'm going to create a new integer in here. I'm going to call this base value. Right. Again, I want to randomize it. So I'm going to choose a random integer between 0 and 2. Now it'll never reach 2, so there are only 2 integers it could possibly be, 0 and 1. Right, so base value will have a value of 0 or 1. And I'm going to take that base value and multiply it by 2, the integer 2. So 0 by 2 is 0, 1 by 2 is 2. So it'll now be a value of 0 or 2. Now if I subtract 1 from that, then 0 minus 1 is minus 1, 2 minus 1 is 1. So base value will have a value of minus 1 or 1, random. Okay, so I'm going to return that. Okay, so that should now generate a number that's either minus 1 or plus 1. So I'm going to add this in here. Going back to my spawn enemy, I'm just going to multiply it by switch sign. And that's a function, so I need the brackets. Okay, so that should generate a number between minus drum radius and plus drum radius. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is to work out what the Z position is. So I'm going to create another variable, ZPOS. And I'm going to create another function which is going to use our Pythagoras for us. So I'm just going to go down here and create another function which is going to return a floating point value. And I'm going to call it getZ or getZ. And I'm going to pass the x value to it, which is also a float. So I want to say, well, what is the z value when we've got an x? Right, so in here I'm going to create a floating point variable. I'm going to call this z, and that equals, and we've got the math.f function which contains a function called square root. So this will find the square root of so we've got the drum radius and we want to square that, so we multiply it by itself. And I'm going to take away from that x times x. Right, so that should use Pythagoras to work out what the corresponding z value would be. And I'm going to return z. Right, so going back up here into the spawn enemy, so I'm going to use that function I've just created. So get z, and I'm going to feed in xpos that we worked out in the last one. Now I'm also going to multiply that by switch sign right, so that's our xpos and zpos. Right, the ypos is much easier. And we're just going to use the random range. And I'm going to go between minus drum height and plus drum height. Right, so it's going to create it somewhere on the ring and anywhere between the top and the bottom of our imaginary drum. So the next thing to do is just to put the new enemy there. Good enemy, so we get its transform component, and we're going to have the position. Okay, so we're going to make a new vector 3 out of those 3 numbers. I'm just going to put in X pos, Y pos, and Z pos. So that should put the enemy at the right. Oops, what have we got here? Image position. Put a comma there. That's better. Right. Now we don't need to worry about its rotation because the enemy looks after its own rotation. Remember, at the start it gets it to face the defender ship. Right, after that I'm going to wait for some time before we generate the next one. So I'm just going to put in another yield, return new. Wait for seconds, and again I'm going to make this random. Right, so I think we'll give them a bit of time. Of course, if you made this shorter, I'm using between 6 and 16 seconds. If you made it shorter than that, the game would become much more difficult. Right. So that should actually deal with generating ships. All we have to do is in the start is to start the crow routine. Right, let's just test that code. Okay, it seems fine. And back to Unity. Now we just have to wait for the new field to appear. There it is, so we've got the enemy ship field, so we'll just drag that into there. Now, will it work? Let's see. Right, we don't actually want the enemy on the scene anymore, so I'm just going to delete that. Let's see if it works. Just no enemies so far, but I don't know where they're going to appear from, so I'll just keep looking around. Oh, there's one. Got one. There's another one. Got that one too. Oh, and another one. That's me done for. As you can see, we have got a playable game now, but one thing that's missing, we're not getting any points, and when the game is finally over, we're just left looking at these bits of space dust hurling towards us. So we're going to need points, and we're going to need some way of determining when the game is over. Look at that next time.